Hi everyone. Before we get into today's readings, I just want to make a comment. Hey, look, I want to apologize. The audio, and if you want to call it picture quality of this video, it's got some issues. I've tried to insert pictures in here, like book covers, various historical artifacts, if you will, and literally Final Cut Pro, which is a MacBook, an Apple product, will not let me put in these products or these images. It literally messes up with the synchronization of the audio. So the audio, it just literally, if I put a picture in, it will mess up the sequence of audio because I have it chopped up in blocks and some other funky stuff. Plus, also, you might even hear it as I do this voiceover right now or just narration, whatever. The voice might be a little tinny, echoey. I'm sorry for all this. I don't know why it's doing it. But I will try to get it fixed and improved for the next session. But I really feel bad about this because I do try, even as an amateur one-man show, I try to give you a decent quality product. So forgive me. And anyway, let's continue on with today's readings. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Welcome to today's reading of Neal Stephenson's In the Beginning Was the Command Line. Before I begin reading, I just want to make a comment about something. Now, if you've been following the previous sessions, you've noticed that a lot of these readings were very short, 16 minutes, 20 minutes, etc., stuff like that. Well, the reason is, what you see as a 20-minute video took me about 2.5 to 3 hours to do. I have to read it, I make mistakes, so I go back and reread my lines, reread a paragraph, etc. Sometimes I've even had, whole books just disappear. I've had a page or two just disappear in my recordings, and I had to go back and redo the entire thing. So this all takes time. So, I hope you understand and appreciate the work that goes into this. And what I'm going to try to do for going forward with OS Shock, which is the current chapter we're on, I'm going to try to extend this out and make this kind of like a super session. Right now, we are on page 91, and the book ends on page 151. So we got exactly 60 pages. I'm going to try to make this a little bit longer. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and begin with OS Shock. Young Americans who leave their great big homogeneous country and visit some other part of the world typically go through several stages of culture shock. First, dumb, wide-eyed astonishment, then attentive engagement with the new country's manners, cuisine, public transit system, and toilets, leading to a brief period of fatuous confidence they are instant experts on the new country. As the visit wears on, homesickness begins to set in, and the traveler begins to appreciate, for the first time, how much he or she took for granted at home. At the same time, it begins to seem obvious that many of one's own cultures and traditions are essentially arbitrary. It could have been different. Driving on the right side of the road, for example. When the traveler returns home and takes stock of the experience, he or she may have learned a good deal more about America than about the country they went to visit. For the same reasons, Linux is worth trying. It is a strange country indeed, but you don't have to live there. A brief sojourn suffices to give some flavor of the place, and more importantly, to lay bare everything that is taken for granted, and all that could have been done differently under Windows or Mac OS. You can't try it unless you install it, and with any other OS, installing it would be a straightforward transaction. In exchange for money, some company would give you a CD-ROM, and you would be on your way. But a lot is subsumed in that kind of transaction, and it has to be gone through and picked apart. We like plain dealings and straightforward transactions in America. If you go to Egypt and say, take a taxi somewhere, you become a part of the taxi driver's life. He refuses to take your money because it would demean your friendship. He follows you around town and weeps hot tears when you get in some other guy's taxi. You end up meeting his kids at some point and have to devote all sorts of ingenuity to finding some way to compensate him without insulting his honor. It is exhausting. Sometimes you just want a simple Manhattan-style taxi ride. But in order to have an American-style setup, where you can just go out and hail a taxi and get on your way, there must exist a whole hidden apparatus of medallions, inspectors, commissions, and so forth, which is fine as long as taxis are cheap and you can always get one. When the system fails to work in some way, it is mysterious and infuriating and turns otherwise reasonable people into conspiracy theorists. But when the Egyptian system breaks down, it breaks down transparently. You can't get a taxi, but your driver's nephew will show up on foot to explain the problem and apologize. Microsoft and Apple do the same things the Manhattan way, with vast complexity hidden behind a wall of interface. Linux does things the Egyptian way, with vast complexity strewn about all over the landscape. If you've just flown in from Manhattan, your first impulse would be to throw up your hands and say, for crying out loud, will you people get a grip of yourselves? But this does not make friends in Linux land any better than it would in Egypt. You can suck Linux right out of the air, as it were, by downloading the right files and putting them in the right places. But there probably are not more than a few hundred people in the world who could create a functioning Linux system in that way. What you really need is a distribution of Linux, which means a prepackaged set of files. But distributions are a separate thing from Linux per se. Linux per se is not a specific set of ones and zeros, but a self-organizing net subculture. The end result is collective lubrications is a vast body of source code, almost all written in C, the dominant computer programming language. Source code just means a computer program as typed in and edited by some hacker. If it's in C, the file name will probably have a .c or .cpp on the end of it, depending on which dialect was used. If it's in some other language, it will have some other suffix. Frequently, these sorts of files can be found in a directory with the name / that is, src, which is the hacker's Hebraic abbreviation of source. Source files are useless to your computer and of little interest to most users, but they are of gigantic cultural and political significance because Microsoft and Apple keep them secret while Linux makes them public. They are the family jewels. They are the sort of thing in Hollywood thrillers is used as a MacGuffin. The plutonium bomb core, the top secret blueprints, the suitcase of bearer bonds, the reel of microfilm. If the source files for Windows or Mac OS were made public on the net, then those OSs would become free like Linux. Only not as good because no one would be around to fix bugs and answer questions. Linux is open source software, meaning simply anyone can get copies of its source code files. Your computer doesn't want source code any more than you do. It wants object code. Object code files typically have a suffix .o and are unreadable to all but a few highly strange humans because they consist of ones and zeros. Accordingly, this sort of file commonly shows up in a directory with the name /bin for binary. Source files are simply ASCII text files. ASCII, and that's ASCII for those who don't know, ASCII, denotes a particular way of encoding letters into bit patterns. In an ASCII file, each character has 8 bits all to itself. This creates a potential alphabet of 256 distinct characters, and that 8 binary digits can form that many unique patterns. In practice, of course, we tend to limit ourselves to the familiar letters and digits. The bit patterns used to represent those letters and digits are the same ones that were physically punched into the paper tape by my high school teletype, which in turn were the same ones used by the telegraph industry for decades previously. ASCII text files, in other words, are telegrams, and as such, they have no typographical frills. But for the same reason they are eternal, because the code never changes, and universal, because every text editing and word processing software ever written knows about this code. Therefore, just about any software can be used to create, edit, and re-edit source code files. Object code files, then, are created from these source files by a piece of software called a compiler, and forged into a working application by another piece of software called a linker. The triad of editor, compiler, and linker, taken together, form the core of a software development system. Now it is possible to spend a lot of money on shrink-wrap development systems with lovely graphical user interfaces and various ergonomic enhancements. In some cases, it might even be a good and reasonable way to spend money. But on this side of the road, as it were, the very best software is usually the free stuff. Editor, compiler, and linker are to hackers what ponies, stirrups, and archery were to the Mongols. Hackers live in the saddle and hack on their own tools, even while they are using them to create new applications. It is quite inconceivable that superior hacking tools could have been created from a blank sheet of paper by product engineers. Even if they are the brightest engineers in the world, they are simply outnumbered. In the GNU Linux world, there are two major text editing programs: the minimalist VI or V, known in some implementations as Elvis, and the maximalist Emacs. I use Emacs, which might be thought of as a thermonuclear word processor. It was created by Richard Stallman. Enough said. It is written in Lisp, which is the only computer language that is beautiful. It is colossal, and yet it only edits straight ASCII text files, which is to say, no fonts, no boldface, no underlining. In other words, the engineering hours that in the case of Microsoft Word were devoted to features like mail merge and the ability to embed feature-length motion pictures in corporate memorandum were in the case of Emacs focused with maniacal intensity on the deceptively simple seeming problem of editing text. If you are a professional writer, i.e., if someone else is getting paid to worry about how your words are formatted and printed, Emacs outshines all other editing software in approximately the same way that the noonday sun does the stars. It is not just bigger and brighter, it simply makes everything else vanish. For page layout and printing, you can use TeX or TEX, a vast corpus of typesetting lore written in C and also available on the net for free. I could say a lot about Emacs and TeX, but right now I am trying to tell a story about how to actually install Linux on your machine. The hardcore survivalist approach would be to download an editor like Emacs and the GNU tools, the compiler and linker, which are polished and excellent to the same degree as Emacs. Equipped with these, one would be able to start downloading ASCII source files /src and compiling them into the binary object code files, the /bin files, that would run on the machine. But in order to even arrive at this point, to get Emacs running, for example, you have to have Linux actually up and running on your machine. And even a minimal Linux operating system requires thousands of binary files, all acting in concert and arranged and linked together just so. Several entities have therefore taken it upon themselves to create distributions of Linux. If I may extend the Egyptian analogy slightly, these entities are a bit like tour guides who meet you at the airport, who speak your language, and who help guide you through the initial culture shock. If you are an Egyptian, of course, you see it in the other way. Tour guides exist to keep brutish outlanders from traipsing through your mosques and asking you the same questions over and over again. Some of these tour guides are commercial organizations, such as Red Hat Software, which makes a Linux distribution called Red Hat, that has a relatively commercial sheen to it. In most cases, you put a Red Hat CD-ROM into your PC and reboot, and it handles the rest. Just as a tour guide in Egypt will expect some sort of compensation for his services, commercial distributions need to be paid for. In most cases, they cost almost nothing and are well worth it. I use a distribution called Debian. The word is a contraction of Deborah and Ian, which is non-commercial. It is organized, or perhaps I should say it has organized itself, along the same lines as Linux in general, which is to say that it consists of volunteers who collaborate over the net, each responsible looking after a different chunk of the system. These people have broken Linux down into a number of packages, which are compressed files that can be downloaded to an entirely function Debian Linux system, then open up and unpacked using a free installer application. Of course, as such, Debian has no commercial or no distribution mechanism. You can download all Debian packages over the net, but most people will want to have them on a CD-ROM. Several different companies have taken upon themselves to decoct all of the current Debian packages onto CD-ROMs and then sell them. I buy mine from Linux System Labs. The cost for a 3-disc set containing Debian in its entirety is less than $3. But this is an important distinction. Not a single penny of that $3 is going to any of the coders who created Linux, nor to the Debian packagers. It goes to Linux Systems Labs, and it pays not for the software or the packages, but for the cost of stamping out the CD-ROMs. Every Linux distribution embodies some more or less clever hack for circumventing the normal boot process and causing your computer, when it is turned on, to organize itself not as a PC running Windows, but as a host running Unix. This is slightly alarming the first time you see it, but completely harmless. When a PC boots up, it goes through a little self-test routine, taking an inventory of available disks and memory, and then begins looking around for a disk to boot up from. In any normal Windows computer, that disk will be a hard drive, but if you have your system configured right, it will look first for a floppy or CD-ROM disk and boot from that if one is available. Linux exploits this chink in the defenses. Your computer notices a bootable disk in the floppy or CD-ROM drive, loads in some object code from the disk, and blindly begins to execute it. But this is not Microsoft or Apple code, this is Linux code. And so at this point, your computer begins to behave very differently from what you're accustomed to. Cryptic messages begin to scroll up the screen. If you had booted a commercial OS, you would at this point be seeing a Welcome to Mac OS cartoon or a screen filled with clouds and the blue sky and a Windows logo. But under Linux, you get a long telegram printed in stark white letters on a black screen. There is no welcome message. Most of the telegram has a semi-inscrutable menace of graffiti tags. What follows is a series of texts that is hard to read and make sense of while reading aloud, but it is computer text. It is Linux text, and this is me speaking, not Neal Stephenson. So what I want to do is just take a moment and make a little bit of commentary here. Yeah, it's kind of funny, when he writes this book in 1999, for those who are young and may not know, CD-ROMs had become popular in the mid-1990s. Popular enough that I want to say, by late 90s, most computers had them. Floppy drives were around. Floppy drives were like those little 3.5 inch, or if you go older, 5.25 inch discs. And if you go really old, like when I was a rinky-dink little guy, 8 inches. And the irony with floppy disks was the bigger the disk, the less memory held. The smaller the disk, the more memory. And incidentally, if you notice, the typical USB drive or thumb drive that you use today, which I got one in my hands, is smaller than the 3.5 inch floppy, smaller than a CD-ROM, and it holds more memory. So I guess in an ironic sense, the smaller the memory unit, the more memory it will eventually hold. But it's interesting how he mentions this internet stuff, because he's writing in the late 90s. But in the early 90s, the idea of, say, like one of us, the average person, I think I'll just go to the internet and get myself a copy of Linux. Sure, why not? Yeah, that didn't happen. You get like 91 or 92. Again, the World Wide Web hadn't developed yet. And going on your typical bulletin board service like we had back in the 80s, it was really expensive. I think I said in one of these readings, I had a chance to go on a bulletin board service for like 1 month in like 1989-ish, using a dial-up phone. My mom, she paid for the service. None of us had any idea how much this was going to cost, but it was like $300. So if you think $300 is expensive then, think about $300 in like $1989, $90, over 30 years ago. Yeah, that killed that. But thankfully, as the World Wide Web began to develop, and this began with Mosaic, which was the first browser, if I'm correct, got really popular in the U.S. with Netscape Navigator, and of course everything else after that. The cost started coming down. It became affordable, and then eventually, it kind of like almost became free. So downloads became a practical thing, and Linux at that time was very cheap. Very small. It was a very small file. So it was very easy to download, even over something like an analog system. Nowadays, it would literally just be a couple seconds or so if you were to download one of those old files. But I remember downloading stuff in the late 90s, and it could take what might be a couple minute download today on the old analog systems. It might take you a couple hours to do that. But back in the 80s, when we had the old bombs like 96 bomb, what was it, 3600 bomb, like on Commodore 64s, those files would have taken an entire day. Just for those who are curious about the progression of technology. All right, so we're going to skip all the text that makes no sense to read off in the book. Again, buy the book, right? Always buy the book for all the information. And now we're going to skip ahead back to the text. The only parts of this that are readable for normal people are the error messages and warnings, and yet it's noteworthy that Linux doesn't stop or crash when it encounters an error. It spits out a pithy complaint, gives up on whatever processes were damaged, and keeps on rolling. This was decidedly not true of the early versions of Apple and Microsoft OSs, for the simple reason that an OS that is not capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time cannot possibly recover from errors. Looking for and dealing with errors requires a separate process running in parallel with the one that has erred, a kind of superego, if you will, that keeps an eye on all the others and jumps in when one goes astray. Now that Mac OS and Windows can do more than one thing at a time, they are much better at dealing with errors than they used to be. But they are not even close to Linux or other Unixes in this respect, and their greater complexity has made them vulnerable to a new types of errors. Okay, that is the end of OS Shock. Now, our next chapter will be Fallibility, Atonement, Redemption, Trust, and other arcane technical concepts. So that would bring us to page 104, and we only have to go to page 150, so we're getting there, people. We are getting there. But before I roll up this chapter, I do make another comment about he's talking about these OSs could not walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. That was true. Today, for example, we take multitasking as a given, where literally I can have multiple panes open. I can like sit here talking to my computer, edit this video, have YouTube running in the background, and have Microsoft Word all at the same time, and it's no big deal. But up until about the mid-90s for Windows, that was a no-go. Literally, it was like if you, for example, let's assume YouTube was around, you could only watch YouTube. That's it. And if I want to work on my Word document, I got to turn off Windows, go into the Word document, and that's all I can do. But once if I remember correctly, it was like around when Windows 95 came out, that's when everything changed. And you could start doing that. Now with Mac OS, I couldn't tell you because I didn't use Mac OS at the time. But in the late 90s, that's when Apple picked up Steve Jobs again, and he got his Next Step, their Next Step company that he founded, and he got their OS, which became the foundation for Mac OS and really helped revolutionize that, if you will. Okay, enough rambling there. Next, on to our next chapter. Fallibility, Atonement, Redemption, Trust, and other arcane technical concepts. Linux is not capable of having any centrally organized policies dictating how to write error messages and documentation, and so each programmer writes his own. Usually they are in English, even though tons of Linux programmers are Europeans. Frequently they are funny, always they are honest. If something bad has happened because the software simply isn't finished yet, or because the user screwed something up, this will be stated forthrightly. The command line interface makes it easy for a programmer to dribble out little comments, warnings, and messages here and there. Even if the application is imploding like a damaged submarine, it can still usually eke out a little SOS message. Sometimes, when you finish working with a program and shut it down, you find that it has left behind a series of mild warnings and low-grade error messages in the command line interface window from which you launched it, as if the software were chatting to you about how it was doing the whole time you were working with it. Documentation under Linux comes in the form of MAN, short for manual pages. You can access these either through a GUI, which is graphic user interface, or from the command line, again MAN. Here is a sample from the MAN page for a program called RISH, RSH. Stop signals stop the local RISH process only. This is arguably wrong, but currently hard to fix for reasons too complicated to explain here. The MAN pages contain a lot of such material. which reads like the terse mutterings of pilots wrestling with the controls of damaged airplanes. The general feel is of a thousand monumental but obscure struggles seen in the stop action light of a strobe. Each programmer is dealing with his own obstacles and bugs. He is too busy fixing them and improving the software to explain things at great length or to maintain elaborate pretensions. In practice, you hardly ever encounter a serious bug while running Linux. When you do, it is almost always with commercial software. Several vendors sell software that runs under Linux, and there is more available each month. The operating system and its fundamental utility programs are too important to contain serious bugs. I have been running Linux every day since late 1995 and have many applications programs go down in flames, but I have never seen the operating system crash. Commercial OSs have to adopt the same official stance toward errors as communist countries had towards poverty. For doctrinal reason, it was not possible to admit that poverty was a serious problem in communist countries, because the whole point of communism was to eradicate poverty. Likewise, commercial OS companies such as Apple and Microsoft can't go around admitting that their software has bugs and that it crashes all the time, any more than Disney can issue press releases stating that Mickey Mouse is an actor in a suit. This is a problem, because errors do exist and bugs do happen. Every few months, Bill Gates tries to demo a new Microsoft product in front of a large audience, only to have it blow up in his face. Commercial OS vendors, as a direct consequence of being commercial, are forced to adopt a grossly disingenuous position that bugs are rare aberrations, usually someone else's fault, and therefore not really worth talking about in any detail. This posture, which everyone knows to be absurd, is not limited to press releases and ad campaigns. It informs the whole way these companies do business and relate to their customers. If the documentation were properly written, it would mention bugs, errors, and crashes on every single page. If the online help systems that come with these OSs reflected the experiences and concerns of their users, they would largely be devoted to instructions on how to cope with crashes and errors. But this does not happen. Joint stock corporations are wonderful inventions that have given us many excellent goods and services. They are good at many things. Admitting failure is not one of them. Heck, they can't even admit minor shortcomings. Of course, this behavior is not as pathological in a corporation as it would be in a human being. Most people nowadays understand that corporate press releases are issued for the benefit of the corporation's shareholders and not for the enlightenment of the public. Sometimes the results of this institutional dishonesty can be dreadful, as with tobacco and asbestos. In the case of commercial OS vendors, it is nothing of the kind, of course. It is merely annoying. Some might argue that consumer annoyance over time builds up into a kind of hardened plaque that can conceal serious decay, and that honesty might therefore be the best policy in the long run. The jury is still out on this in the operating system market. The business has expanded fast enough that it's still much better to have billions of chronically annoyed customers than millions of happy ones. Most system administrators I know who work with Windows NT all the time agree that when it hits a snag, it has to be rebooted, and when it gets seriously messed up, the only way to fix it is to reinstall the operating system from scratch. Or at least this is the only way that they know of to fix it, which amounts to the same thing. It is quite possible that the engineers at Microsoft have all sorts of insider knowledge on how to fix the system when it goes awry. But if they do not seem to be getting the message out to any of the actual system administrators I know. Now, forgive me for a moment, please. I'm going to stop the narration. Usually I like to read this continuously through until I reach the end of the chapter. Then I'll make my comments. But I think right now is a good time to stop and make some comments. All right, first, Neal Stephenson, he talks about the reliability of Linux and all, how it doesn't really crash or anything. I guess for the most part that's okay, but I've worked with Linux Red Hat personally. And I guess from time to time we might have issues, but like he would say, that's a commercial release. That's not the pure Linux. So, there's something to be said there. But to get to the bigger comment, it has to do with his comments about Microsoft, Windows, and all the other Microsoft products. It really is true. They are buggy. I think I mentioned maybe earlier in some of these chapters about how the their philosophy, or maybe even in this book, I forget. But basically, it's just good enough. That was their whole design. Just get something good enough. It didn't have to be perfect or even great. Well, to sum all this up, let me tell you a nerd joke from the 90s. This is what I learned back in college, and this will sum up Microsoft great. All right, so God wants to end the world. It's run its course. It's time to end it. So he summons, as of the mid 1990s, the three most powerful people in the world: Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin, and Bill Gates to heaven in a dream like stance. Dream like vision, if you will. Yeah. So anyway, God lets all three of them know that, hey, the world's run its course. It's time to end the world, and I'm going to end it in 3 days. So after that, all three of them wake up. Bill Clinton decides, hey, it's time to hit national TV. So he makes a White House press release, TV, saying, hey, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is that God loves us. The bad news is he's going to end the world in 3 days. And of course, there is panic throughout the United States. Boris Yeltsin gets on public radio and he says to the Russian people, I've got bad news and I got worse news. The bad news is God is real. The worst news is he's going to end the world in 3 days. Of course, all throughout Russia, there's panic. Then Bill Gates thinks and ponders about it, and he decides to write an email. And in his email, he says, good news. We don't have to fix Windows 95. That right there tells you the Microsoft mentality behind their products. Okay. Now back to the narration. Because Linux is not commercial, because it is in fact free, as well as rather difficult to obtain, install, and operate, it doesn't have to maintain any pretensions as to its reliability. Consequently, it is much more reliable. When something goes wrong with Linux, the error is noticed and loudly discussed right away. Anyone with the requisite technical knowledge can go straight to the source code and point out the source of the error, which is then rapidly fixed by whichever hacker has carved out responsibility for that particular program. Contrast this with the experience that I had when I tried to install Windows NT 4.0 on the very same machine about 10 months later, in late 1997. The installation program simply stopped in the middle with no error messages. I went to the Microsoft support website and tried to perform a search for existing help documents that would address my problem. The search engine was completely non-functional. It did nothing at all. It did not even give me a message telling me that it was not working. Eventually, I decided that my motherboard must be at fault. It was of a slight unusual make and model, and NT did not support as many different motherboards as Linux. I am always looking for excuses, no matter how feeble, to buy new hardware. So I bought a new motherboard that was Windows NT logo compatible, meaning that the Windows NT logo was printed right on the box. I installed this into my computer and got Linux running right away. Then attempted to install Windows NT again. Again, the installation died without any error message or explanation. By this time, a couple of weeks had gone by, and I thought that perhaps the search engine on the Microsoft support website might be up and running. I gave that a try, but it still didn't work. So I created a new Microsoft support account, then logged on to submit the incident. I supplied my product ID number when asked, and began to follow the instructions on a series of help screens. In other words, I was submitting a bug report, just as with the Debian bug tracking system. It's just that the interface was slicker. I was typing my complaint into little text editing boxes on web forms, doing it all through the GUI. Whereas with Debian, you send in a simple email telegram. I knew that when I was finished submitting the bug report, it would become proprietary Microsoft information, and other users wouldn't be able to see it. Many Linux users would refuse to participate in such a scheme on ethical grounds, but I was willing to give it a shot as an experiment. In the end, though, I was never able to submit my bug report, because a series of linked web pages that I was filling out eventually led me to a completely blank page, a dead end. So I went back and clicked on the buttons for phone support, and eventually was given a Microsoft telephone number. When I dialed this number, I got a series of piercing beeps and a recorded message from the phone company saying, "We're sorry, your call cannot be completed as dialed." I tried the search page again. It was still completely non-functional.
Then I tried choosing PPI support, pay per incident, again. This led me through another series of web pages until I dead ended at one reading. Notice, there is no web page matching your request. I tried it again, and eventually got to a pay per incident screen reading out of incidents. There are no unused incidents left in your account. If you would like to purchase a support incident, click OK. You will then be able to prepay for an incident. The cost per incident was $95. The experiment was beginning to seem rather expensive, so I gave up on the PPI approach and decided to have a go at the facts or FAQs posted on Microsoft's website. None of the available FAQs had anything to do with my problem except for one entitled, I am having some problems installing NT, which appears to have been written by Flax, not engineers. So I gave up and still to this day have never gotten Windows NT installed on that particular machine. For me, the path of least resistance was simply to use Debian Linux. In the world of open source software, bug reports are useful information. Making them public is a service to other users and improves the OS. Making them public systematically is so important that highly intelligent people voluntarily put time and money into running bug databases. In the commercial OS world, however, reporting a bug is a privilege that you have to pay lots of money for. But if you pay for it, it follows that the bug report must be kept confidential. Otherwise, anyone could get the benefit of your $95. This is, in other words, another feature of the OS market that simply makes no sense unless you view it in the context of culture. What Microsoft is selling through pay per incident isn't technical support so much as the continued illusion that its customers are engaging in some kind of rational business transaction. It is a sort of routine maintenance fee for the upkeep of the fantasy. If people really wanted a solid OS, they would use Linux. And if they really wanted tech support, they would find a way to get it. Microsoft's customers must want something else. As of this writing, January 1999, something like 32,000 bugs have been reported to the Debian Linux bug database. Almost all of them have been fixed a long time ago. There are 12 critical bugs still outstanding, of which the oldest was posted 79 days ago. There are 20 outstanding gray bugs, of which the oldest is 1,166 days old. There are 48 important bugs and hundreds of normal and less important ones. Likewise, BEOS, which I'll get to in a moment, has its own bug database, http://www.be.com/developers/bugs, with its own classification system, including such categories as not a bug, acknowledged features, and will not fix. Some of the bugs here are nothing more than BE hackers blowing off steam and are classified as input acknowledged. For example, I found one that was posted on December 30th, 1990. Hey, I just want to stop for a second and say I'm sorry. My throat was dry. I was having a little bit of problem pronouncing a couple words there. And to be honest, that was funny. That was good. Okay, back to the story. Unfortunately, the B bug reporting system strips off the names of the people who report the bugs to protect them from retribution. Therefore, I don't know who wrote this. So it would appear that I'm in the middle of crowing about the technical and moral superiority of Debian Linux. But as almost always happens in the OS world, it's more complicated than that. I have Windows NT running on another machine, and the other day, January 1999, when I had a problem with it, I decided to have another go at Microsoft support. This time, the search engine actually worked, though in order to reach it, I had to identify myself as advanced, and instead of coughing up some useless FAQ, it located about 200 documents. I was using very vague search criteria that were obviously bug reports, though they were called something else. Microsoft, in other words, has actually got a system up and running that is functionally equivalent to Debian's bug database. It looks and feels different, of course, and it took a long time for me to find it, but it contains technical nitty-gritty and makes no bones about the existence of errors. As I've explained, selling OSs for money is a basically unattainable position, and the only way Apple and Microsoft can get away with it is by pursuing technological advances as aggressively as they can and by getting people to believe in and to pay for a particular image. In the case of Apple, that of the creative free thinker, and in the case of Microsoft, that of the respectable techno bourgeoisie. Just like Disney, they're making money from selling an interface, a magic mirror. It has to be polished and seamless, or else the whole illusion is ruined and the business plan vanishes like a mirage. Accordingly, it was the case until recently that the people who wrote manuals and created customer support websites for commercial seem to have been barred by their employers' legal or PR departments from admitting, even obliquely, that the software might contain bugs or the interface might be suffering from the Blinken 12 problem. They couldn't address users' actual difficulties. The manuals and websites were therefore useless and caused even technically self-assured users to wonder whether they were going subtly insane. When Apple engages in this sort of corporate behavior, one wants to believe that they are really trying their best. We all want to give Apple the benefit of the doubt because mean old Bill Gates kicked the crap out of them and because they have good PR. But when Microsoft does it, one almost cannot help becoming a paranoid conspiracist. Obviously, they are hiding something from us, and they are so powerful. They are trying to drive us crazy. This approach to dealing with one's customers was straight out of the Central European totalitarianism of the mid-20th century. The adjectives Kafkaesque and Orwellian came to mind. It couldn't last any more than the Berlin Wall could, and so now Microsoft has a publicly available bug database. It's called something else, and it takes a while to find it, but it's there. They have, in other words, adapted to the two-tiered Eloi-Morlock structure of technological society. If you're an Eloi, you install Windows, follow the instructions, hope for the best, and dumbly suffer when it breaks. If you're a Morlock, you go to the website, tell it that you are advanced, find the bug database, and get the truth straight from some anonymous Microsoft engineer. But once Microsoft has taken this step, it raises the question once again of whether there is any point to being in the OS business at all. Customers might be willing to pay $95 to report a problem to Microsoft if, in return, they get some advice that no other user is getting. This has the useful side effect of keeping the user alienated from one another, which helps maintain the illusion that the bugs are rare aberrations. But once the results of those bug reports become openly available on the Microsoft website, everything changes. No one is going to cough up $95 to report a problem when chances are good that some other sucker will do it first and that instructions on how to fix that bug will then show up for free on a public site. And as the size of the bug database grows, it eventually becomes an open admission on Microsoft's part that their OS has just as many bugs as their competitors. There is no shame in that, but it puts Microsoft on equal footing with the others and makes it a lot harder for their customers who want to believe to believe. Okay, everyone, that finishes our chapter. The next chapter will be Memento Mori. That's where we'll kick off next time. Now I got to make an apology. I had an ambitious goal to finish this book and make it one long, video or audio recording, if you will. However, I got to be honest with you. The readings, the recordings take a lot of time. I'm trying to make this professional as possible. So many times when I make little slip-ups, I'll spend time editing those out. But I gotta be honest, it's so time consuming that I just have to let little minor slip ups sometimes stay in there in order to keep this going, which you heard in this presentation. So what I'm probably gonna be doing forward is, just for the sake of getting this out and for everybody's enjoyment, I need to let a few minor bugs here and there slip in, bugs, or I should say slip ups, in order to, speed up the editing process. Now, let's talk about something else though. In this book, it's really interesting. Let's talk about the last chapter. Talking about Microsoft, how in order to report a bug, you got to pay $95. I vaguely remember that. I do remember those days. Now I had Windows 95 because I didn't have the money, or I was either cheap, one of the two, and didn't want to upgrade. So I remember during this time when the internet was all revolutionary, you could go online and do this, but people complain about, man, I got to pay this money for it. This book says $95. I forget the exact cost. But compare that today, whereas as I read this 2023, this stuff's free. You can go to the customer support FAQ community, and you'll get the answer there. And in some ways, the problem, how shall you say, has gone swung the opposite way. So like if you had to pay just to report a minor problem, which was $95, let's call that swinging to the left, way left, because that's ridiculous to have to pay that much money to maybe not get even the right answer on something for something trivial. But on the other hand, nowadays when you do have a real question, it's sometimes hard to get actual customer support. What the companies want you to do is use that community service where you post your question to the community, and then somebody from the community who may be an engineer, a fan of the product, they'll answer it for you. So in that regard, it's like swung way over to the right. And what you need is more like a central point of view, a balance. There you go. Whereas like, okay, I have some common questions. I got a problem. You send it to customer service. But however, and they can answer it. However, but for those questions that you like, I want now, or maybe it's really complicated, then you would pay a little extra money because you're making yourself a priority versus the free service, which may take a little bit more time or be limited in its offerings. That would be fine. I think sometimes, depending on the programs you buy today, or computers even, with their extended warranties, they'll offer you something like that. You can get simple basic service, but if you want the good stuff, you got to pay the extra money. So, just something to think about. Now, I want to give you an IT lesson here. Okay, so give me a second as I fumble through my pages here, because I was reading you a web page, and it was for BEOS. All right, so let's go back, and this book is page 112, and I was reading you about the BEOS. Now, I read to you http://www.be.com/developers/bugs. Now, what's the problem with that? Think about it for a second. Okay, here's the thing. This is your IT lesson for today, security. It's HTTP. HTTP is an old protocol. That's the old way to do it. It's Hypertext Transport Protocol. Now, for fun, go look up Google, anything, right? And you'll notice that your browser will automatically go to HTTPS, which Hypertext Transport Protocol Secure. And that is the big difference between 1999 and 2023, or even the last few years for that matter. When you look up on the internet today, you already have a secure protocol. And that's so the stuff that you see, those HTTP, that's either a dead site, maybe it could be a pirate site. It's a when you say hackers trying to, or a scam site. Yeah, I'm not using the exact IT term for it, cybersecurity term. But yeah, you'll find those are like illegitimate. That's just called it. It's illegitimate web pages. So be careful of that. Okay, so that's all my rambling for now. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, bye.